The strong don't fight for what they want. They simply take back what was already theirs. I stood in front of Charlotte Powell's house, my fingers lightly brushing through my sleek blonde hair, my gaze settling on the second-floor window where the white curtains swayed gently. Inside was the perfect life I never had. A life that should have been mine. Perhaps, if I were Charlotte, I too would believe in good things. I would believe in fairness, family, and that fate always smiled upon the kind-hearted. But unfortunately, I was not her. I was Brooklyn Stewart. And I knew that in this world, happiness never just falls into anyone's lap. If I wanted it, I had to take it for myself. I rang the doorbell. 1, 2, 3 seconds. The door opened. Brooklyn. Charlotte stood there, her brown eyes wide, stunned as if she were seeing a ghost from the past. She looked no different than she had years ago, still elegant, still gentle, still carrying that unbearable aura of virtue. She might have forgotten me, but I had never forgotten her. Oh my God, is it really you? Charlotte raised a hand to cover her mouth, then, without hesitation, pulled me into a hug. I caught the scent of vanilla perfume on her collar, the fragrance of a woman who had everything. I tightened my grip on her shoulder slightly, a small smile playing at my lips. It's me. Surprised? She pulled back, her hands still gripping my arms, her eyes shimmering with emotion. You've been gone for so long. Mom was so worried. How have you been? Where have you been living? Why didn't you ever reach out? I gave a soft chuckle, my gaze flickering to the wall behind Charlotte, where perfect family photos hung, her husband, and a little girl with a beaming smile. A complete life. I turned back to her, feigning emotion. It's a long story, but I think I might stay for a while. Charlotte nearly jumped in excitement. That's wonderful. Family is always here for you, Brooklyn. She was right. This family would be mine now. I met Ethan Murphy that evening. Charlotte's husband, the man I had only seen in the photos Mom sent me. But pictures couldn't capture the presence of a man in real life. Ethan entered the living room, sleeves rolled up, a glass of wine in hand, walking with effortless confidence. When his eyes met mine, that sharp blue gaze lingered on me a beat too long. A look that was anything but polite. Brooklyn. He tilted his head slightly, a faint smile appearing on his lips. Charlotte's told me a lot about you. I took his hand in mine, deliberately holding it a second longer. His grip was warm, strong. I could feel the muscle beneath his shirt, the faint trace of his cologne drifting between us. Well, hope she didn't say anything bad about me, I replied, raising an eyebrow just enough to imply something more. Ethan chuckled, but in his eyes, there was something else. Something I recognized immediately. Interest. Dinner was warm and familial, but I didn't care for their cheerful conversations. I was watching. I watched the way Ethan listened to Charlotte, how his eyes occasionally drifted away. I watched the way little Amelia chattered about school, how Ethan smiled at her, but not with full enthusiasm. I watched how Charlotte looked at her husband with absolute trust. Too absolute. That was her problem. Charlotte was too certain of everything she had. She believed that once she had secured a man like Ethan, she would never lose him. That was why I knew I had a chance. At the end of dinner, as Charlotte stood to clear the table, I leaned slightly toward Ethan. You're lucky to have a family like this, I murmured, my voice dripping with honey. Ethan leaned back in his chair, taking a sip of his wine, eyes flicking toward me. Yeah, I suppose I am. But I didn't miss the slight shrug. That wasn't the answer of a man who was truly happy. Charlotte returned, sitting beside Ethan, her hand resting gently on his. Ethan took her hand instinctively, but I saw it clearly. He wasn't holding on. He simply wasn't letting go. I sipped my wine, a quiet smile forming on my lips. Brooklyn, how long are you planning to stay? Charlotte asked as the family gathered by the fireplace. I swirled the wine in my glass, my eyes flitting toward Ethan for the briefest moment before answering. I'm not sure yet. Maybe longer than you think. Charlotte beamed. Ethan remained silent. But I swear, I saw the way he looked at me, 1 second too long. The look of a man who had just recognized the existence of something forbidden. something he couldn't turn away from so easily. And that was the moment the real game began. A man only needs a little, one lingering glance, one deep word, one soft breeze to make him waver. And me? I am a storm. I had been staying at Charlotte's house for 3 days, long enough to understand how this family operated. Charlotte was the kind of woman who believed her marriage was untouchable. She wasn't wary. She wasn't worried. She never considered that the smallest things could lead a man astray. I didn't need to rush. This game required patience. I started with Amelia. Amelia was smart and lively, but like any other teenage girl, she craved to be understood. Charlotte loved her, but in the way of a mother who was too rational, too controlling. I had noticed it from the very first dinner, how Charlotte constantly corrected her, reminding her what not to do, what not to say. And I used that. I complimented her curly hair, while Charlotte always told her to brush it neatly. I laughed when Amelia played mischievous little tricks, while Charlotte only sighed. I told stories about my rebellious youth, stories that made Amelia's eyes shine with fascination, while Charlotte could only shake her head. "You're going to spoil her," Charlotte laughed, but I knew there was a trace of irritation in her voice. "Kids need their own space," I shrugged, gently pushing the wedge a little further. "Don't you think Amelia deserves a little more freedom?" Charlotte pressed her lips together, her gaze flickering toward her daughter. I had planted a seed in Charlotte's mind. A tiny thought that maybe, just maybe, she didn't really understand her own child. I didn't go after Ethan right away. That was the mistake of impatient women. I didn't attack directly. I simply placed him in situations where he would have to make his own choices. I started with small things that carried weight. That morning, when I stepped into the living room in a soft silk nightgown, I found Ethan making coffee. He was alone. "Good morning," I said, deliberately letting my voice carry the huskiness of just waking up. Ethan looked up, his eyes lingering on me for a fraction of a second before he turned back to his coffee. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice steady, but I noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. I stepped closer, not too much, but enough for the warmth of my body to radiate. I reached for the coffee cup beside him, but accidentally brushed my fingers against his arm. Just a light touch. A single fleeting moment. But Ethan felt it. "Very well," I smiled softly, bringing the cup to my lips. "It's been a long time since I've had such a peaceful sleep." Ethan didn't respond. He simply nodded, but I knew I had left an imprint on his mind. There was nothing wrong with Charlotte's marriage, but I would make her think there was. That afternoon, as Charlotte and I sat on the couch, I casually brought up the topic. "How long have you and Ethan been married?" Charlotte smiled, her expression filled with pride. "Almost 10 years now." "Wow! Almost 10 years." I dragged out my words, as if pondering something. Charlotte frowned slightly. "What is it?" "It's just." I exhaled softly, pretending to hesitate. "Ethan is a wonderful man." "You're very lucky." "I know," Charlotte chuckled, but something in her voice shifted, just a bit of caution. "He's the kind of man every woman would want," I continued lightly. "I mean, successful, attractive, responsible. Not everyone can keep a man like that forever, right?" Charlotte fell silent. I could feel her thoughts beginning to spin. I didn't need to say it outright. I only needed to leave a lingering question in her mind. She would torment herself with it. That night, I sat reading on the couch, pretending not to notice Charlotte stepping out of the bedroom, her gaze quietly settling on Ethan, who was sitting at his desk, lost in thought. For the first time, Charlotte truly looked at her husband. For the first time, she asked herself, "Does Ethan still love me?" She had never questioned it before. But now I had made her wonder. Charlotte bit her lip, slowly walking toward Ethan, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Ethan flinched slightly. A small reaction, but I saw it, and so did Charlotte. Her eyes darted toward me, and I saw it, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her perfect face. I suppressed a smile, slowly rising to my feet, silently leaving the living room. But just before I disappeared up the stairs, I heard Charlotte's voice, soft, hesitant, but filled with doubt. "Ethan, are you okay lately?" I closed my eyes, savoring this small victory. Just 3 days, and I had already created the first crack in her perfect wall. A small crack, but I knew one thing for certain. Once a wall has a fracture, all it takes is a gentle push for it to crumble entirely. People often think betrayal is a sudden decision. But in reality, it is a process that, if done correctly, will make them fall into it willingly, without any need for force. And in the end, Ethan Murphy walked right into the path I had laid out for him. At first, Ethan resisted. He was the kind of man who convinced himself that he was good, faithful, always doing the right thing. But I knew that a man's loyalty only remained strong when he had no reason to break it. And I became that reason. It started with seemingly casual conversations. Words spoken at just the right moments, when he didn't even realize he was vulnerable. "I envy Charlotte. She has a man like you." A harmless statement. A simple compliment. But I knew exactly what it would do. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Are you flattering me?" "No," I smiled, swirling the wine in my glass, locking eyes with him. "I'm just telling the truth." Ethan said nothing more, but I noticed the way he started looking at me differently. That night, Charlotte had an unexpected meeting at Amelia's school, leaving Ethan and me alone at home. I didn't rush. I simply created a situation that Ethan could no longer ignore. I walked down the stairs in a red silk dress that hugged my figure, not too revealing, but enough to draw attention. I knew Ethan was sitting on the couch, a glass of whiskey in hand, his gaze unconsciously drawn to me. I could feel it. I stepped closer, sitting beside him, slowly crossing my legs. "You seem tense," I said softly, tilting my head slightly as I looked at him. Ethan sighed, his grip tightening around his glass. "It's just a lot on my mind." "Do you want to talk about it?" He looked at me, his eyes wavering. And then, the moment came, the moment I had been waiting for. Ethan lifted his hand, absent-mindedly brushing his fingers against my wrist as I rested my hand on my thigh. A fleeting touch, but enough for both of us to know that the line had been crossed. "Brooklyn, this," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. I said nothing. I simply leaned in, keeping my gaze locked with his. "Ethan, you don't have to say anything." I traced my fingers lightly along his strong jawline. And then, he kissed me. Not a hesitant kiss. Not a gentle one. But a collapse. A surrender. Ethan Murphy had finally fallen into the trap. What happened next was inevitable. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan could no longer live in his false happiness. I had made him believe that his love for Charlotte was nothing more than obligation, duty, no longer passion. He became obsessed with me. With our secret meetings. With the moments when he felt like he was finally living true to himself. And then, Ethan confessed. On a Saturday evening, Charlotte was busy rearranging paintings in the living room while I sat quietly on the couch, pretending not to care. Ethan walked over, his voice dry. "Charlotte, we need to talk." I saw the way Charlotte froze, the way her hands clenched around the picture frame. "What is it, love?" she asked, smiling, but I knew that smile would soon disappear. Ethan exhaled, his gaze avoiding hers. I don't feel the same anymore. Between us." Charlotte's expression shattered. "What do you mean?" Her voice trembled. Ethan stole a quick glance at me, but I kept my eyes on my wine glass as if none of this concerned me. "I love Brooklyn," Ethan finally said. "I want a divorce." At that moment, I watched Charlotte's world collapse. Her eyes filled with horror, absolute disbelief. No, that's impossible." Charlotte shook her head, as if trying to reject reality. "Brooklyn, you're my sister." I lifted my gaze and smiled softly. "You're mistaken," I said, my voice gentle but cold. "I was never your sister." Charlotte ran upstairs, slamming the door behind her. I could hear her muffled sobs through the wooden panels. I turned to Ethan, taking his hand in mine, squeezing it lightly. "Are you sure?" I asked quietly. Ethan looked at me, his eyes filled with turmoil, but also a newfound certainty. "I'm sure," he said. I smiled. I had won. Charlotte had lost the one thing she thought she would always have, the man she believed would never leave her. And I had everything. People say happiness is a gift from fate. I don't believe that. Happiness isn't something you wait for. It's something you take. I had taken Ethan Murphy. Charlotte Powell had lost. But this game was far from over. When a woman is betrayed, she has two choices. She can collapse and cry like a weakling, or she can rise and strike back like a cornered wolf. Charlotte chose the second. I had expected Charlotte to break down, to pack her things, take Amelia, and leave this house in tears. I had imagined her becoming a pitiful ghost of herself, wandering through late afternoons with vacant eyes. But she didn't. She didn't leave. And that was the first sign that I had underestimated her. 3 days after Ethan's so-called confession, there were no packed suitcases. No explosive fights. No desperate pleading. Charlotte continued her life as if nothing had happened. She still woke up early to make breakfast for Amelia. She still went to work at the school. She still cooked dinner like the perfect wife. There was only one difference. Charlotte no longer spoke to me. Not a word. Not a glance. Not a single reaction. She acted as if I didn't exist. And that unsettled me. Ethan had started sleeping on the couch. He looked exhausted, drained. I knew he was waiting for Charlotte to say something, maybe a scolding, maybe a fight to release the tension. But she didn't. She remained disturbingly calm. And that was the second sign that I had underestimated her. On the 5th day after Ethan announced the divorce, Charlotte asked to meet me alone. "I want to talk," she said, looking me in the eye for the first time in days. I smirked. Finally. We sat across from each other at a small cafe near the house. Charlotte wore a sleek gray blazer, her hair neatly tied back, her face makeup-free yet as flawless as ever. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms, ready for a confrontation. "So, what do you want?" I asked, keeping my tone light but laced with provocation. Charlotte took a sip of her coffee, then met my gaze head-on. "You think you've won, don't you?" I raised an eyebrow, smirking. "Haven't I?" Charlotte was silent for a moment before she slowly pulled a white envelope from her bag and placed it on the table in front of me. "Why don't you open it and see for yourself?" Frowning, I picked up the envelope and pulled out the documents inside. I looked down. And I froze. The papers in my hands were not divorce papers as I had expected. They were my financial records. Debts. Unpaid credit card bills. Transactions from the nightclubs where I used to work. Everything about my past was in Charlotte's hands. I looked up, my heartbeat quickening. "How did you?" Charlotte tilted her head, her gaze sharp. "Did you really think you were that smart, Brooklyn? Did you think I would sit still while you destroyed my family?" I clenched my fists. "What are you going to do with them?" Charlotte slowly leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Nothing. Yet. But if you stay in my house for one more day, if you continue thinking you can take Ethan, I will send these documents to everyone who needs to see them." "You're threatening me?" I hissed, but a wave of panic stirred inside me. Charlotte laughed, a laugh I had never heard from her before. It was cold. Powerful. "No, Brooklyn. This isn't a threat." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "This is a fact." I gripped the papers tightly, feeling cold sweat trickle down my spine. Charlotte hadn't crumbled. Charlotte had struck back. Before I could say anything, she pulled out another sheet of paper from her bag and placed it on the table. "And one more thing," she said, her voice light. I looked down, and my world shattered. A DNA test. For the baby I was carrying. It wasn't Ethan's. I inhaled sharply, my chest tightening. "Where did you get this?" "Don't ask stupid questions, Brooklyn," Charlotte cut me off, her eyes burning with quiet fury. "I gave you the chance to walk away peacefully. But you didn't know when to stop." I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Charlotte stood, picked up her purse, and looked down at me one last time. "I won't tell Ethan, if you disappear from our lives by morning." Her voice was gentle, but I knew this was my final warning. She turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving me sitting there, my hands clenched around the papers, my body trembling with rage. I had lost this round. But I had never been one to give up. I watched Charlotte's figure disappear beyond the window, and in my mind, there was only one thought. Charlotte, don't think this game is over. Someone like me never truly loses. I might fall, I might lose everything, but I always come back. Because I don't know how to give up. I left the cafe that day with my fingers clenched so tightly that my nails dug into my skin. Rage roared inside me like a storm, ready to tear through everything in its path. Charlotte had played a flawless game. She hadn't just cornered me, she had made me destroy myself with my own hands. Ethan was no longer a piece I could manipulate. And worst of all, I knew I couldn't let him find out the truth about the child growing inside me. Because if he did, I would truly lose everything. I decided to leave Ethan and Charlotte's house that very night. No goodbyes. No last words. Ethan called me twice. I didn't answer. Because I knew that the moment I heard his voice, I wouldn't be able to control my emotions. The next morning, I woke up in a dingy motel, the room reeking of cigarettes and damp wood. No more lavender-scented sheets, no more luxurious breakfasts prepared by Charlotte. I had returned to where I truly belonged. The bottom of society. What was bound to happen, happened. I was sitting in that cramped room when my phone vibrated. Ethan. I hesitated for a second, then picked up. Brooklyn, his voice was low, carrying a coldness I had never heard before. We need to talk. I swallowed. What is it? Whose baby are you carrying? I froze. On the other end, Ethan let out a bitter laugh. You thought Charlotte wouldn't say anything? You thought you could fool me forever. I gripped my phone tightly, trying to come up with a lie. But nothing could save me from this blow. Ethan exhaled sharply. Brooklyn, I lost everything because of you. I destroyed my family. For what? My chest tightened. I love you, Ethan, I whispered, my voice breaking. I really do. No, Ethan cut me off, his tone sharp as a blade. You don't love me. You only love the feeling of having me. Then, he hung up. I stared at the screen, feeling as if someone had just punched me in the gut. Ethan was done with me. I had lost him. And once Ethan turned his back on me, the others followed. The men who once chased after me, who longed for me, they vanished. The rumors spread faster than I expected. They knew I had nothing left. No money. No security. No longer a mysterious beauty. I had become discarded prey. I was forced back into the life I had once run from, a cheap bar where middle-aged men eyed me with hunger, but none truly wanted to give me a way out. My growing belly made me less desirable. The debts piled up. No one wanted to save me. I had once thought I was smarter than everyone. But I had forgotten one truth. This world never forgives a woman who falls from grace. They worshipped me when I was at the top. But the moment I stumbled, they only stood back, arms crossed, watching me struggle. I gave birth in a small public hospital alone. No Ethan. No Charlotte. Just me and the baby. The first time I looked at her, a tight lump formed in my throat. A tiny, innocent life, completely unaware of her mother's filthy past. I gently touched her little hand, and in that moment I knew I couldn't afford to collapse. I had lost everything, but I still had her. I still had one last chance to come back. 3 months later, I stood in front of Charlotte's house again. It was raining. Cold. But I didn't care. I looked through the window, watching Charlotte laugh with Amelia. Ethan stood beside them, his hand resting on Charlotte's back, his gaze filled with peace. They had found their way back to each other. I clenched my fists, my breathing uneven. Charlotte had won. But that didn't mean I had lost. I knew I had made mistakes. I knew I had lost everything. But I wasn't the kind of woman who accepted defeat forever. I always found a way back. Did Charlotte really think she could get rid of me that easily? I scoffed and turned away. Regret? No. I have never regretted anything. I only wish I had gone further. I sat on an old park bench, my gaze drifting into the distance, toward the women like Charlotte, the ones who lived perfect lives. The women with families, loving husbands, and children who grew up wrapped in warmth and security. I once had the chance to step into that world. But I lost it all. No, more accurately, they stole it from me. Charlotte was still happy with Ethan. I knew that because I had seen her. I had been watching them from a distance. They had gone back to their perfect little life, as if nothing had ever happened. Ethan had returned to being the devoted husband, the loving father. Charlotte had won everything. And me? I had been cast aside, discarded like someone who no longer held any value. I had been erased from their perfect picture. I left that town, taking my child with me to a new city. No one wanted to hire someone like me, a woman with stains in her past, a single mother with a child to raise. I waited tables, worked as a cashier, took any job that would keep money in my pocket. The men who once hovered around me had disappeared. I was no longer desirable when I had nothing left to offer them. But I survived. And I waited. She was the only thing I had left in this world. Every time I looked into her clear, innocent eyes, I felt something I had never felt before: responsibility. I didn't know what love was. I didn't know what sacrifice meant. But I knew one thing: I would never let my daughter live the life I had. I had grown up being compared, always feeling lesser than Charlotte. My daughter would not. She would never be the one to lose. 3 years after I left, I returned to that town. No one expected me to come back. No one wanted to see me. But I didn't care. From a distance, I watched Charlotte and Ethan walk into a cafe with Amelia. A perfect family. They didn't see me. But I saw them. And I wondered, had Ethan truly forgotten me? Did Charlotte still fear me? I smirked. Of course, she did. Someone like me never disappears completely. They might think they've won. They might think I've given up. But they're wrong. I always find my way back. Always. I have never known how to stop. Do you think I've lost? Do you think I'll accept this life and disappear forever? I am nothing like Charlotte. I don't believe in justice or fate. I only believe in the strong and the weak. And you know what? In this world, only those who never give up are the ones who truly win. So tell me, if it were you, would you stop? Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe, because this game is far from over. I will return, stronger than ever.